So I introduced them earlier this morning. Some of you have met them now. And please, until the food gets taken away, continue to enjoy. We're all family here, right? But Michael Dorf and Sherry Colb are law professors at Cornell, and they are going to speak on a very interesting topic that one doesn't always think about. Some sort of philosophical intricacies about abolition and the question of who actually benefits from abolition. So, please, take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks for doing this conference. This is really fascinating, and eager to talk to you about something called the non-identity problem. Those are nice chimes. Okay. So the non-identity problem is a problem that is related to debates and discussions about animal rights. But let me first describe the problem, and then I'll tell you why it has anything to do with animal rights. So it asks whether an act can be wrongful if it simultaneously...
Can I start again? Where is that noise coming from? That's the problem.
I'm so sorry.
I thought it might be the bullet call.
So it asks whether an act can be wrongful if it simultaneously causes harm to somebody, but also gives rise to the existence of that same somebody. So without the act, this individual who is suffering the harm wouldn't suffer the harm, but also wouldn't exist. And we assume, for purposes of this problem, that the individual has a life worth living. We can talk about what that means. And so this will be clear, I think, with an example. So imagine that there's a fertility doctor, and a patient comes, a couple goes to the fertility doctor, and the doctor takes a sperm cell and injects it into an egg cell, but due to negligence, selects a sperm cell that has a defect, and the defect is going to give rise to chronic pain in the individual who is born, and instead of selecting a healthy sperm cell. And so the individual is born and has this chronic pain, but nonetheless has what we would call a life worth living. And so let's call this individual Donald. And so can Donald say, hey, doctor, you harmed me? And there's a certain paradox to it, because on the one hand, if not for the doctor, there wouldn't be the chronic pain. But also, if not for the doctor, there wouldn't be Donald. So Donald can't sort of step back from a position of I existed here, and then you caused me harm, and now I exist here suffering this harm. Instead, there's just like no Donald, and now Donald, who has a life worth living, has this harm. So, so many people's intuitions say, well, what the doctor did is still wrongful, did something wrong to Donald, even though there was this paradox. Okay. So what is the relevance of this puzzle to animal rights? Well, it's a particular kind of argument that people make, and it sort of relates to something that Gary said earlier about this professor who has sheep that he creates and then slaughters. And he might say in his own defense, well, the sheep can't be wronged by the slaughter because I created them with the idea of slaughtering them ultimately in mind. And were they not to be slaughtered, they would never have come into existence at all. So long as their lives are worth living, I did a good thing rather than a bad thing by bringing them into existence. So, and in general, a non-vegan might say, well, if not for me, these animals wouldn't exist because I demand the creation of these animals by eating animal products, and so they've come into existence, and it's because of me, and if everyone were like you, vegan, these animals would be deprived of existence. And then the vegan responds, well, but you're ordering that they be hurt and slaughtered, and I'm sparing the animals that slaughter and harm. So if farmed animals' lives are worth living, then non-vegans are not hurting them. They're like, the animals are like Donald, who exists because of the doctor's negligence, but is still better off existing, even with the harm. But again, that seems counterintuitive, and it's a phrase that I've come up with, which is slaughterhouse fruits. Consuming the fruits of the slaughterhouse, which is basically what we do when we eat animal products, as we learned from Gary Francione earlier today, all animal products are very directly tied to the slaughterhouse. Can that actually be helpful to animals? How can that possibly be right? So Michael and I set about thinking along two tracks. First, can we solve the non-identity problem? And second, if we can't, can we make an argument that animals somehow fall outside, that the consumption of animal products falls outside of the non-identity problem? So the first thing to say, I think, about all of this is that if a life is not worth living, there's no non-identity problem, right? If Donald's suffering makes his life so terrible, especially without the help of Steve Bannon, that he just wishes every day that he was never born, along with half the nation. Well, then there's no paradox, because the creation actually harmed him, both by bringing him into existence and by causing the harm that he's the chronic pain. And for the vast majority of farmed animals, including fishes, if you ever visit a fish farm, you basically have barrels of fishes that can't even, at first you don't even know what you're looking at, because they don't look like fish. It just looks like water that's moving in a barrel. So that, for those animals, and for the vast majority, for 99+% of the animals people eat and whose products people eat, they do not have lives worth living. So there's no paradox. They were better off before they came into existence, because their existence is horrible. And so it's clearly a harm to bring them into existence and to cause them the pain that they've experienced, and it's a benefit to spare them existence by being vegan. And some would say that all animals used as resources have lives that are not worth living. So, in part because of the tremendous violence directed towards them for their entire life. I've heard from farmers who really had small farms, and what they said is that their children had to get used to violence toward animals from a very young age, and that the parents would sometimes be sort of startled because their kids would be crying, and say, what are you crying about? It's like, well, when you brand the animals, it hurts, and they're in pain, and you can see it, and the parents had really stopped seeing it. But that's just part of farming, all the things. And the parents said eventually the kids got used to it. So people get used to violence. Michael Pollan once said that he, in the Omnivore's Dilemma, that he, I think, went and slaughtered a pig, and he told himself, I can do it, then I'm entitled to eat it. But the fact that people are comfortable watching someone else being tortured does not mean that it's okay, because people can get used to seeing anything, just about anything. Anyway, so there's all this violence, and so there is this tremendous violence, and also a lot of the traits that animals have on farms are really terrible for them. Turkeys that people eat and look forward to eating and think of the slaughter of whom was a celebration of a holiday, they can't even reproduce naturally because the part that's called their breast is so big, so that they actually have to be artificial. They can only be recreated by artificial reproduction. So, and a lot of the other animals are sort of, when they live past a certain age, they start getting heart condition. The chickens, and people say, oh, they just make eggs. Well, they don't. There's a reason they just make eggs. Their close relative in the wild is the red jungle fowl, and they lay about 15 times fewer eggs a year than the hens on farms, because they've been bred to leach all the calcium out of their bodies and make these eggs that people want to eat. So in part because of the physical violence done to them, in part because of their traits, maybe they're just their lives are not worth living. And if that's right, there's no non-identity problem. But maybe, we don't know that this is true, but maybe there's some small number of farmed animals who live lives worth living prior to their slaughter. I learned recently of a farm where the farmer only slaughters one animal an hour, and what this enables them to do is to wash down the slaughter area so it doesn't smell like blood, because animals smell the blood and become terrified, because they are in fact very much conscious of their surroundings. So maybe they're sparing them the pain, and the rest of the time they get to play with the other animals and so on. So imagine that there's this life worth living. Does that mean that eating them does them a favor? And let me be clear that we think that this is absolutely wrong and horrible, even when they're getting the okay, the less terrible life. But we're trying to take on the hardest version of this question of non-identity problem. So there are a few answers to this question, what possible answers. So one is a writer, Professor Ori Herstein, and he asked in the context of, can people demand reparations for injustices that have been done to them? He specifically talks about Holocaust victims, descendants, and he talks about descendants of enslaved people in the United States. And he says that these people, all of them, would not exist if not for the atrocities that were committed against their ancestors, because it takes so little to change the course of who gets born and who gets conceived and so on. So can people who would not exist but for this earlier atrocity, can they turn around and say, we deserve reparations, you harmed us by doing this stuff to our ancestors? And it's not exactly the non-identity problem, but it's very closely related to it. So does the non-identity problem mean, well, since this act at time one gave rise to the existence of all these people at time two, and their lives are worth living, does that mean they can't complain? Does that mean only the direct victims of the atrocities, only people who were enslaved themselves, who were murdered themselves, who were kept in death camps themselves, only they get to complain, but their descendants don't, because they never would have come into existence if not for the atrocity? And of course, everyone's answer is, well, that can't be. That would be wrong. That can't be. So Ori's answer is that you solve it by talking about the group instead of the individual. And the group would still exist. The group existed before you harmed the group. The group is less well off because of what you did to the group at time one, and therefore they can complain. And so there's no paradox. And I think that that's an elegant solution, but it doesn't quite work, because you still have an individual who wouldn't exist. And so you still have, at least potentially, that paradox. Although if you like the solution, it works for animals too, right? The group of animals who existed prior to domestication would have given rise to a different group of animals than we have today, who would be happier and wouldn't be tortured and so on and slaughtered. But so maybe animals can complain as part of that group. But if you still sort of want the individual and wonder, well, what do we do about the individual who exists, who wouldn't exist before, has a life worth living? And that can be true for the human and the animal. So we have a second solution. We have a few solutions, and that was one that we think is problematic. Here's a second one, and then Michael will talk about a third and a fourth. So the second solution is that existence can be worse than non-existence, but it can't be better. And so what I mean is, if the life is terrible enough, it can be worse than not existing at all. You can imagine, certainly can imagine that, but it can't be better, such that, like, well, you know, the people who don't exist or the animals who don't exist are feeling deprived by virtue of not existing, and they're missing out in some kind of tangible way. That non-existence is never worse than existence. And one way of thinking about this is that we don't confer a benefit on someone by bringing them into existence. In fact, Shauna Schifrin has argued that we've kind of harmed someone whenever we bring them into existence, even people, because we didn't get consent. So, you know, nobody is asked, do you want to come into existence? And then when they say, okay, we conceive them. That we just kind of force all of these creatures, including us, into existence, and then whatever hardships we have in our lives, we have to face, and nobody asked us. So we don't confer a benefit when we bring someone into existence. Even if this creature, Donald's life is great, creating him was not a favor to him. And it's not when you say, well, I gave you apples, oranges, and bananas, that's different from saying I gave you existence. It's a different kind of thing. It's not a benefit, even if it's a good life. And if we accept that existence does not benefit the non-existent, even though existence can harm the non-existent, right? You can make things worse. Well, that solves the non-identity problem, because you don't get credit for bringing the animal into existence. And therefore, any harm you do to them is wrong. And so when you consume something, when you consume an animal product, and that gives the farmer the message, okay, so I need to make more of these animals to satisfy this demand, then the new animals who come into existence, they're not benefited by existence. And then all the terrible things that happen to them are harms. And we're responsible for those harms by having demanded them. And we don't get to say, yeah, but we gave them this life, because giving someone a life is does not confer a benefit on them. And even if they have other good things that happen, we know that doing good things for someone does not entitle us to do bad things to them, right? If we have a friend and we give them lots of great things, then one day we come over and we kick them in the shin, and they say, hey, what are you doing? We say, well, you know, I gave you a lot of donuts last week, so you were due. That wouldn't work. So, right, so we would hold them accountable for the bad things. And okay, so it's time for you to talk. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so let me add to Sherry's thanks to Gary Steiner and everybody at Bucknell for putting this together, and for all of you for sticking around. I should say I'm not a philosopher. I am a dilettante. I took a lot of philosophy as an undergraduate, however, 35 years ago-ish. Even from people who know a lot of philosophy, none of them were vegans though, but I did study from, Nozick and Rawls and Sandel and those folks. So I like to think that I care about philosophy. And so when we started thinking about the non-identity problem, I thought, well, I should read a little bit about this. And it turns out the best, the only full book written on it is a book called The Non-Identity Problem and the Ethics of Future People. Notice this people doesn't say future beings. And it's by a guy named David Boonin, who's a philosopher at the University of Colorado. Also happens to be a guy I've known for many, many years. And Sherry and I did a conference at the University of Colorado back in the fall. So it was great. I read the book. And Boonin's argument, it has two parts. First, he goes through all of the attempts by other philosophers to solve the non-identity problem. And he says none of them works. And then he says, he offers his own solution, which is to say it's not a problem after all. That is to say, you should accept the conclusion that you don't harm a being by performing an act that both disadvantages that being relative to some other being and creates the being if the being has a life worth living. And he would say person, I say being. Okay, the argument that Sherry just gave you, so he doesn't consider Herstein's solution because he doesn't consider the problem that Herstein is considering to be, strictly speaking, a non-identity problem. It's a related problem. So he doesn't consider that. He also, he addresses a version of the argument that Sherry just made, but Sherry's solution, I think, doesn't fall prey to the critique that Boonin offers of the standard solution. Right? So the standard objection goes like this. You can't compare existence to non-existence because existence is you can have different states of existence, but non-existence is not a state of existence. So non-existent people don't have zero well-being, against which you're going to measure if you're going up or down. They don't have any state of well-being at all. And Boonin challenges that. The way he challenges that is by saying, well, we can imagine circumstances in which somebody's life is so miserable that non-existence would be preferable, right? So he gives the example of somebody who's on fire, and for that person, and they're on fire and they're going to be slowly be tortured to death. It's like, for that person, killing them instantly is a mercy, right? Why? Because non-existence for that person is better than existence. And Boonin says, and therefore, the incoherence objection falls apart. And he says, and anyway, even if you were to accept the incoherence claim, well, then you couldn't run in the other direction and say you're harming them because if you can't compare up, you can't compare down. I think Sherry's solution escapes Boonin's critique because it's asymmetrical. He only considers the symmetrical case. He doesn't consider the asymmetrical case. So that's that solution. Let me offer a couple other solutions. So I described to my father, who's a 86-year-old retired actuary, but also was a philosophical dilettante, and he actually did a few years of graduate school in philosophy many years ago. So I described the problem to him, and he immediately saw the issue, and then he said, well, you know, it might not be wrong to anybody, but it's nonetheless wrong. Right? So and this to me says, there are two ways of thinking about that. One is you could think it's a sort of deontological proposition that it is simply wrong to create a being with some disadvantage when you could have done something else that wouldn't have had that unfortunate effect, even if the being has a life worth living, in the way that Kant would say that lying is wrong, even if it's for the benefit of the person to whom you tell the lie, right? So that's a sort of Kantian version of it. And there's a sort of virtue ethics version of the same thing, right? These are just, it's the person who makes the decision in a variant of the standard non-identity problem, where you're choosing between two courses, one of which is going to create somebody with a disability that makes which their life is still worth living versus somebody who doesn't have it and therefore has greater satisfaction. It's still wrong. It's a non-virtuous choice to choose the former rather than the latter. I think there's a lot to that idea, to either the Kantian version or the virtue ethics view, but I still think it misses what the moral intuition is that leads us to think the non-identity problem is a problem. And that is the intuition that doing the thing doesn't just create a sort of harm in the air, as it will, but actually is a harm to the being who is thereby created, right? And so that's why I wasn't satisfied with this idea that it's just wrong in itself in some way. Because it may be wrong in itself, but it's not only wrong in itself. It feels like it's also a wrong to the, in our example, animals who are being exploited, even if in this hypothetical case, or the very rare real case, they're being exploited in a way that nonetheless leaves them with lives worth living. And so the question is, how do we justify that moral intuition? And so Sherry's answer is one. You don't get credit for bringing them into existence sufficient to offset the harm that's also being done to them. The other answer that I want to explore a little bit now goes like this. I want to say that this is not actually an example of the non-identity problem, right? That is to say, when the non-vegan says to us, or when the former president of the university said to Gary Steiner, well, these sheep wouldn't exist but for my ultimate decision to eat them, right? They are identifying as problematic, not something that is characteristic of the being, right? It's not like the person who is born from the sperm that has the problem, therefore they're going to face disadvantages because that's just who they are and given the nature of that, the rest of the world, right? There's a further act in violation of this being's rights, right? So when the president of the university says, hey, I created these sheep for the purpose of slaughtering them. If I didn't do that, so I get to do it. Well, no, that's not true. I can explain that by reference to a conversation I had with a former friend. Is not quite accurate, but it's close enough. Some years ago, I don't know, when I was still foolish enough to put things on Facebook other than like pictures of my kids or like, hey, here's something I wrote, check it out. I got into an argument with someone I knew about some sort of animal issue. And this person is religious. And so she at some point, she made the argument that, well, Adam named the animals, and therefore that entitles humans, descendants of Adam, to eat them. To which I responded, I named my children, doesn't entitle me to eat them. So now that was sort of silly, but she didn't just mean named, right? The idea is that for these other animals, you brought them into existence. Well, we wouldn't make that claim for any other kind of being, right? If instead of raising sheep, the former president of the university, former president, right, not the current, former president of the university was running, raised his own children, right? That wouldn't entitle him to slaughter and eat them at the end. And so there's this further act, right, that distinguishes this from the non-identity problem. But now you say, well, okay, so that takes care of the former president of the university. It takes care of my friend with a very strange idea about naming. But what about the typical consumer of animal products who is not, after all, the one doing that further act, right? That is to say, you might think that while from the perspective of the farmer, the harm is something additional that the farmer does to the animals after having created it, having brought them into existence. From the perspective of the consumer, it's all one thing, right? There's no way to say to the farmer, I just want them to exist, right? You say, I want my, chicken or eggs or dairy or whatever it is, right? And so from the perspective of the person who wants the animal product, it is sort of baked into the identity of that of the animals that they will be raised on a farm. Right? They're not going to. It's all one unitary thing. And so the consumer might say, and so from my perspective, all that matters is, does that animal have a life worth living on net? And if the answer is yes, then I'm not doing them all harm, even though I know they're being brought into a life where it's in the nature of their identity, so far as I'm concerned, that it's going to involve much suffering and ultimately slaughter. And so I think what's the response to that contention? I think there are two sorts of answers. Well, one answer, and then I'll sort of see where it goes. So the main answer I want to give to that is to say, no, you've got it exactly backwards. You're mostly not demanding the existence of the animal with the sort of killing of the animal or the exploitation as the side effect. The existence of the animal is almost the side effect from your perspective. That is to say, you are actually demanding that the things that are necessary to get the animal products be done to that animal in order to satisfy your desire. And so it is not just that they happen to be part of that system. It's that you are actually, that's really the primary driver of what you're demanding. Now, there's a response to this, I think, that the non-vegan can make, which I want to explore, which is to go to a higher level of generality. Right? And so what the non-vegan might say is, no, you've misunderstood me. I'm not demanding that the hens have these calcium deficiencies and the prolapses. I'm not demanding that the cows have their babies taken away from me. I'm not demanding that the turkeys be slaughtered at a very young age when they're still making peep sounds, which is characteristic of babies. What I'm demanding are the delicious foods I love so much. And I don't care how it's produced, but if you tell me it's produced at the cost of suffering and slaughter of these animals, then for me the question is, well, but do those animals on that have a life worth living? And if the answer is yes, then I'm good. Okay. And so that, I think, is the sort of, and again, right, putting aside for the moment, for the purpose of argument, the fact that most of them don't have lives that are worth living. That I think is the sort of hardest version of this to answer. And so my answer, I think, it has a few pieces. One is to say, well, if you're only demanding the thing that you describe as the delicious food at the end, and it doesn't matter how it comes out, right? That's only because you're blind to the system of food production, right? You couldn't possibly be demanding that thing with any kind of awareness if you made yourself aware of the way in which food gets produced in the world in which we live. And then a second answer I think I want to give is to say, if that's right, and to the extent that we credit this kind of an argument as actually, symptomatic of a larger set of views, then I think that suggests an avenue of activism, right? It suggests that what the people who, my sort of hypothetical interlocutor here, who's a kind of composite of lots of real world interlocutors, is really saying is, look, I've got lots of rationalizations. One of my rationalizations is that the animals on net have lives worth leading, so I'm good. But what I really want is the stuff that I like, the food and fiber that I think of as that go along with a satisfactory life. Now, that to me, as I say, suggests the most important avenue of advocacy, which is to say, forget about whether the animals we're talking about have lives worth living. You can have a terrific, better life if you give that stuff up and substitute for it other sorts of delicious foods and fiber and so forth. And that there's a practical payoff here to my mind, which is that going through this exercise leads me. I think it's important as a matter of sort of basic philosophy to sort of work out what the right answer is to this objection. But I also think as a practical matter, it leads us to a place where there's a response that gets at what's really driving the objection. And so one question, to sort of finish up, and then I'll show you back up here so we can open up a discussion. One question you might ask is like, why are we taking this question seriously at all, right? And I think, as I said, I think there are sort of three answers. One is I like to engage in a sort of spirit of intellectual charity, right? If somebody asks a question that I really think is like, designed to say, gotcha, right? What about plants question, right? I want to take it seriously because I think, it's possible that they mean it sincerely, right? They really are concerned about high protein deficiency or whatever it is. And even if they don't mean it seriously, the fact that they're, I'll have a more interesting exchange if I assume good faith. Second reason to take it seriously is that sometimes somebody might mean something insincerely, but it's actually an interesting puzzle, right? And so solving it will help clarify our own thinking. So Sherry's first animal rights book, Mind If I Order the Cheeseburger, and other questions people ask vegans, that's the basic approach, right? It's the idea is like, here are a bunch of questions. Many of these questions are not asked sincerely, but we don't really care. We want to see, if it's a gotcha question, well, does it get me? Because answering it will help clarify our own thinking. And then there's third reason, as I say, is taking the question seriously. I think if part of that answering it and seeing why the answer works or doesn't work gets us into the mind of people with whom we're trying to do some advocacy, I think can lead us to fruitful avenues of advocacy. So that, another way of thinking about this is that I think that, for those of you in this audience who are not yet vegan, one of the most important things, maybe more important than anything any of us are saying today, might be, if you really like that chocolate avocado dessert, which doesn't contain any dairy, you might think, hey, actually maybe it's possible to have maybe it's not that important to me to demand these products anymore. Okay, let's stop so we can have some time for discussion. In the back, and you can say whether you want me to answer, Sherry to answer, or both of us to answer, and or you can just not say the preference.
Oh, why are you vegan? And I'm always looking for like a decent tall answer that will work for everyone. Do you have like a certain sense?
Elevator pitch.
The elevator pitch.
Tell them about the T-shirt.
Okay, I will, but this is because Gary asked me to. So there's a T-shirt, and I don't recommend this as your elevator pitch, that says, "I'm vegan because fuck you." But that's not the elevator pitch. That's just a joke. But anyway, so the elevator pitch is, I see you're writing it down, don't write it down. So the elevator pitch is, what I like to say is that I'm vegan because I don't want to harm the other beings on this planet, and I care about animals and humans. There are so many ways in which hurting animals hurts humans too. And I don't like to focus exclusively on that because then it sounds like a sort of Kantian argument, like I don't want to hurt animals because it'll desensitize me to humans. But, I was telling Gary yesterday that I just had learned about how Kentucky Fried Chicken has slaughterhouses and it can't find workers to staff them, the slaughterhouses, because it is so traumatic to work in these places. Basically, their turnover rate is over 100% a year because it is such awful. And these are people who desperately need money and will do almost anything to earn a living, and yet this work is too horrible for them. But anyway, they couldn't find the workers, so they started contracting with local prisons to bring prisoners in who do not have a choice, and they have to work in the slaughterhouses. And one man was interviewed, and he said the worst day of my life was when I was taken out of prison to work in that place. That was a hideous place to work. And there was something about, there's this, if you ever look at the picture of Colonel Sanders of KFC, he looks like a plantation owner. His jacket, the whole thing. And then now he has slaves working at KFC slaughterhouses. And so there's something very disturbing about that. So, but to just mention that you don't want to be violent you don't want to participate in hurting other animals and humans.
Yes.
Sherry, you mentioned before that harm is done to a child from a sperm and an egg. A physician could have the perfect sperm, the perfect egg. But there's one other thing that we don't know how to explain that brings these together. And the maturation of this, one could be ahead, one could be alone. It's not just a matter of that person choosing. It's a matter of, and I don't know what to call it, but because I don't understand the whole business of forming a baby, I understand it, but there's something that's there that we don't understand. So and I'm a physician, I'm an obstetrician, so I have been sued for a problem that's occurred that we didn't have the capabilities as we have now. So I can go back and say, hey, give me that money I gave you. But things happen, If I drive long enough, I'm going to get in an accident, if I like it or not. I don't want to get anyone, but it happens. The same thing happens with the sperm and the egg.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so I didn't mean to suggest that doctors are always at fault in some way whenever there's a problem with the baby or frankly with the adult.
That absolutely that way. But I just wanted to make sure that that people know that there's other things that are involved in.
Of course, yeah. There's so much that's involved. So you have what you might call multiple sufficient causes, but that one necessary cause is the uniting of the, right? If you have a person with chronic pain, you could, in this example, you could say that if that sperm hadn't been used, this person wouldn't exist. But you're absolutely right that there's so much else that goes into it and that could potentially cause a problem as well.
Wait, I just have one other sort of a segue question. You know, I've seen many people die, and if somebody is at the end of their life and there's no way that this person is going to come back, when I first started medicine, you could kick the respirator plug out of the wall and nobody would say anything. You know, now Esquire so-and-so would come down to you immediately. Are you against doing anything who's any person, even a person or an animal that's suffering, to put them down?
No, we had our one of our dogs put to sleep, and we actually are. I mean, I think, and you can tell me if I don't speak for you on this, but I think we both think that the ways that most of the states' laws are structured so that people who are in terrible distress at the end of their life can't do anything about it, that there's no right to die except in Oregon, maybe in Washington.
There are 4 states.
Oh, no, 4. Okay, so, but in 46 states, that's really cruel. So no, so I don't think that I think that existence can be worse than non-existence in that sense, and so that some lives should be ended.
And we do this to animals, but we think twice about people. I mean, on ethics committee, it's horrendous.
Okay.
Is this question, I'm struggling with this, and I think Jerry, he's not sure, so ask me. Is this question any different from the question of somebody saying, what's wrong with me eating animals or exploiting animals as long as they're treated okay? I mean, isn't that really what the question, I mean, you can talk about it as identity, non-identity, right? But really isn't the question, what's wrong, what am I doing wrong if I exploit an animal, like eat an animal, or, I mean, there are also other questions you could have. I mean, you could say, well, you could sort of take the Will Kimmel approach and say, well, you know, because he and I disagree on the inherent problem of domestication. But, that's a different question. That's not really what you're supposed to. But is it really?
Yes, I understand the question. So, yes, here's how it's different. So, the typical person in an advanced society who eats animal products is not involved in the creation of these animal products. So, what that person is doing by abstaining from eating the piece of meat or cheese or egg on their plate is not. When you and I go to a restaurant and we order the vegan option, we are not sparing any of the animals who've already died or whose products have been used to produce the other kinds of animal products. What we're doing is we're not participating in, we're not contributing to demand to the system, and therefore reducing demand. And in a capitalist economy, that means supply will be reduced marginally.
But that's one thing we're doing. It's not necessarily the only thing.
No, I understand, but insofar as we are not participating, the thing we are most directly not participating in is, well, we're not communicating to the rest of the other people that it's okay, but all of it, all of the abstaining from the eating of the already produced animal products is about communicating to people who produce it in the future, don't produce anymore.
Oh, wait, can I just
Yeah.
I take Gary's question to be, well, let's say instead of what we're doing, someone else comes to the table and they say, well, I'm going to order the humanely raised veal or something like that that's on the menu separate. And their question is, why what you're doing any better than what I'm doing, or why is what I'm doing just fine?
Because really what they're saying is that animal had a good life.
Right. And I think it's related. I guess it would be different in if somebody were to like go in the woods and kill a deer and eat that deer, then if they said to you, well, they had a good life, you could respond, yeah, but no thanks to you, the good life, and you just ended the good life and hurt them. Whereas, so it's particularly with domesticated animals that this issue of existence and non-existence comes up. That kind of argument could know it's purpose-bred animals where this arises.
But I think it also depends on this temporal disconnection, right? That is to say, if I can say to the farmer or the person working at the slaughterhouse, it's wrong to kill this animal because that's a harm you're doing to an existing animal, right? I can't say that to the person who wants to go to order the cheeseburger that you're doing a harm to an existing animal by eating that cheeseburger. Or I can say that it's, you know, you're harming your body, you're sending signals. But as far as like direct harm to animals, it's all going to be operated, it's all going to be communicated through demand. And given the amount of time it's likely to take for that marginal increment in demand to be communicated to the system, is likely to examine animals that don't yet exist. And so from their perspective, the idea would be, I'm going to create them. So another way of putting it is that the former president of the university, right, his argument is terrible, right, because he's actually ending the lives of, right, like one, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad that he's raising these sheep, but he has another choice to make, which is whether to kill them later and then eat them. Whereas what makes the consumer's choice different is that it's just one act. It's the eating of the animal now, which communicates create and then harm the animal.
It's also a participation.
Yeah, sure. I agree with that.
And Gary is, I think, right, that our question is very much linked to the question of what's wrong with humanly raised food.
But if the answer to that question is there is no humanly raised food, which we mostly believe, then most of the animals don't have lives worth living, and that's the answer to the whole thing. But the point is that here, even if there were humanely raised food, and even if you're not directly participating, you're still. I think our point comes in at that point. What about the Inuit?
No. Two quick things.
They're non-existent in
Fish farming. Fish farming.
Yes.
What's happening there, they create these genetic monsters there that are severely inbred, and they're escaping into the wild and damaging the wild populations. The fish farming is dead, no doubt. But in terms of your former friends, Adam was at the very least a vegetarian, probably a vegan. So they don't know the Bible.
That's quite possible. I know this person.
Yes.
Vegan movement growing?
Yes.
Growing depends on who you ask.
Yeah, it does depend on who you ask. Certainly there are more people in it.
There are more restaurants that have vegan menus than
Yes.
I remember before.
And there's much more that's marked vegan in the store, which is sometimes it's kind of funny, like you'll get like a bag of peanuts and it'll say vegan, and it's like, well, okay.
It might not be, right? It might add like all sorts of other ingredients besides peanuts.
No, all right.
Or
like raisins. I mean, just things that are. But yes, so I think that if demand, if this reflects demands, then yes, and certainly, when we were younger, nothing was labeled that way. It was really much more complicated.
The fact that Tyson and Hellman's are all feeling kind of fertile.
Yeah, that's a good point. The fact that Hellman's felt the need to sue what was it called? Tetra?
Just made.
Yeah, the Just
Made.
Made.
It turns out that they were engaged in some sort of not non-vegan activity, but.
Well, anyway, but the fact that they felt the need to sue about it suggests that there's an actual threat, and I think dairy purchasing has dropped. More people are getting nut milks and things like that. So
The yogurt's picked up.
Yes, right. So that's partly a marketing thing, but right, there's all this marketing of so-called Greek style yogurt. Yeah. Right. But we're not experts in that question. Can I ask a question? So do any of you think that? So I'm sort of like, I find the non-identity problem interesting, but there are a lot of things I find interesting that other people don't. Right? Do any of you experience it as a genuine puzzle? No? Yeah?
I guess maybe it's just because I'm a philosopher, but it's an idea of just having some sort of discussion or debate over existence and non-existence and what the relationship between them is. I just find it inherently interesting. has all sorts of applications, this being one of them. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I never thought about it until I started taking courses in philosophy, and now I don't know who I am.
I mean, one
Mission accomplished.
I mean, one question you might ask that might, so if you've studied the philosophy of personal identity, right, you might say, well, the whole non-identity problem assumes a kind of straightforward answer to the problem of personal identity, right? So that if you're a Humean or a Buddhist with respect to personal identity, that is to say, you think that, you know, or you think of Heraclitus, right? You're not the same person now that you were 10 years ago, maybe not even the same person you were a moment ago. Then there is no such thing as as continuity of identity over time. And if that's the case, then I don't think we can make sense of this puzzle at all, because, you know, nobody would have existed as they exist now, but for all sorts of things that happen, and they're not the same person anyway. Right? So I think in order even to make sense of the non-identity problem, for it to be a problem, you have to think that you have a conception of stable personal identity over time, and to me that's at least as much of a problem as the non-identity problem. But I think the way that they're related is that in both contexts, I think we have a very clear common sense answer, right? And the very clear common sense answer is, yes, I'm the same person I was 30 years ago, not in the sense that I have all the same values. I can't jump as high. I can't run as fast. I can't do math as quickly as I used to be able to. But I'm still the same person I have, right? And this is what the philosopher John Perry refers to as sort of the sort of common sense idea of personal identity, and it's the one we work with all the time. Likewise, in the non-identity context, you want to say, well, of course you've harmed this person, right? Until the philosopher comes along and problematizes it. So maybe I should ask a question to you philosophers here, right? Which is, what are you up to? Like, what's the point of problematizing all of these things that seem unproblematic? I mean, I know why I'm interested in it, but I'm interested in why you're interested. I'll ask you, you're a philosopher.
I think that Hume would have reasons for thinking that harm is still important, even if the self as such, as a metaphysical entity, doesn't necessarily exist. Ended up writing more justice than he did about these sorts of issues anyway. I guess it's a separate question whether or not the one coheres with the other. But the fact of there's some sort of fact of continuity that deals with going back to some of the things that Gary and Gary were talking about earlier, the way of telling a story or thinking autobiographically in some sense, that is what ultimately coheres these things together for a single person, in addition to some sort of physio or spatiotemporal aspect that ends up holding a lot of weight. There's a place in someone's body that occupies a certain set of space over time that's sort of recognized as continuous and recognized as sort of having the same, or at least something like the same purpose. He talks about the ship that gets rebuilt over the course of the voyage, or the church that burns down and gets rebuilt. We sort of recognize it as being the same in some sense because we have a stake in it. It matters a certain kind of way. So I think even there, there's a way to say that there's a self that does not exist in a metaphysical sense, but that in this other kind of sense really does have real meaning.
That's great.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about the problem of personal identity, and then that's certainly true that if somebody is not the same from moment to moment, then we don't have a non-identity problem. But also, the people's conception of animals as not having this continuous identity is also, obviously, it's part of people's claim that, well, if you harm this animal, there's no, the next second they're a different animal and so on. And of course it's plainly false anyway, even if that were a central piece of identity. Animals remember, and the number of animals who are afraid of men, for example, is really very high. And it's like, well, we have a new puppy we adopted, and he is afraid of new men much more so than of new. I mean, he's afraid of anyone new, but new men in particular. And so we had a friend stay over, and it took until day 3 before he would let this friend hold him.
And the friend's a vegan.
Right. As are the dogs. But you know, they remember if someone harms them, and they generalize in the same kind of ways that people do. And so, and the evolutionary continuity that Gary Steiner was talking about earlier is really true. That there's no real reason to doubt it. And so, because we think a lot of the philosophical decisions to be skeptical about the continuity are very much they're sort of born of emotional investment.
Can I say one more thing about it? So I want to observe what I think is either an irony or a contradiction in one of the first session, right? So when you end slavery, right, the formerly enslaved humans continue to exist, and but slaves, there are no more slaves. Right. There are people, right? Likewise, when you end animal agriculture, the existing animals continue to exist until they die. They don't reproduce, but lots of people don't. People don't reproduce, and there continue to be animals, right? What there don't continue to be animals are animals of that species. But why are we elevating species over either individuals or groups of animals? No. So all I'm saying is that the objection, right? Oh, there aren't going to be any more of this heritage breed of chicken or something, or the kind of turkeys that are grown for right. It's like the very objection assumes there's something valuable about each species apart from the members of that species. And I think there's some things we think in those categories that make sense. Like I think we think it's a shame when a culture dies out, and not just for the people who are part of that culture, but it's just a sort of loss to the universe in some sense. I'm not sure that's true with respect to species, and I'm much less.
It would with dogs. That would be a loss. I mean, most people would feel that way, I think.
It would be
to the humans. A loss to the humans.
It would be a loss to us, sure. Yeah. But I'm saying, like, is it a loss to the universe in some sense, right? Apart from the particular individuals, and I think it's hard to think of that without sort of thinking of species lines as mattering a whole lot.
Well, I think Gary was suggesting that there's something a little paradoxical about the right to not exist. Yeah. I mean, that's really what we're claiming. We're claiming these animals have the right not to be.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, but I mean
that's what we're asking.
And actually, that it was a result of sort of my noticing that in my own work, that I sort of developed the idea that we need to sort of take domestication on as a general matter. So the issue is not about the issue is, can we justify this as a practice morally? If we can't,
We're over time.
Well, we're about done.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.